so much. After looking at the rise of the Swahili culture and all the way from Arabia, how the Arabs came, found the coastal people, intermarried, gave rise to the Swahili culture and people, and later the language. We now look at the effects of that, effects of the rise of Swahili culture on the people of the coast. How did it change the coast in general? Number one, there was introduction of a new language, and of course the language changed. There was no more speaking of coastal languages like Kushites, talk of those other languages, Ndorobo, and so many native languages. They all got lost and replaced by Kiswahili, which was an Afro-Arab language. Being influenced, it borrowed from African and Arabs. It borrowed from African and Arab words, and that was called Kiswahili. That was one effect of the rise of the culture. Another effect of the rise of the Swahili culture on the people of the coast was Islam was widely spread. Islam was widely spread at the coast because the original religions all got lost, and now with the coming of the newcomers, it spelled doom to the old traditional religions, which were very common in the south, because in the north the Islamic influence was too much. So with the coming of these people, even the religion changed. So number three, numerous mosques, Quranic schools, and the Quranic schools were established. Mosques were the centers of worship, and we say the medium of instruction in mosques was Arabic, and of course they were called for prayer. They were called for prayer by special people who shouted and called for prayer, and they were called muazzin. The muazzin is the one that called people for prayer, and they went into mosques, and of course the mosques were also followed by the establishment of Quranic schools, where I told you that these are centers where the young especially were indoctrinated into the Islamic way. Indoctrination is that they were nurtured from the young. They already came knowing that this is how it is done. So the indoctrination of the youth especially was done in Quranic schools, which were very many, especially in the major coastal settlements. Arabic ways of dressing were adopted. Arabic ways of dressing were adopted, like the wearing of veils and long dresses for women, whereas for men it was kanzus and turbans. So it was also borrowed from Arabia, and some people who are against these ways of dressing always condemn. There are some people I found condemning these ways of dressing. That how do people borrow things from dry areas and they bring them here where there is no dryness? That from the desert they use kanzus because they want to reflect sun rays. And where is the sun here, the scorching sun? But see, this was their mode of dressing, even from their homes. That the turbans were intended to prevent the sandy dunes from darkening their heads. That is when they come to despise this kind of dressing. But this is how they dressed, and it was also borrowed from Arabia. We are also told that with the rise of the Swahili culture, trade was boosted. Trade very much boosted. But what was this trade? It was the IOT, commonly known as the Indian Ocean what? Trade. And of course, one of the factors for the rise of this trade was the coming of the Arabs, which Arabs brought about the rise of that, of the Swahili culture. So trade also was boosted, and this was trade in material items, even slaves. The three common items were S1G, that is slaves, ivory, and what? And gold. These were the three basic commodities that the Arabs traded in. And of course, the trade was boosted until the coming of the Portuguese in the 15th century. It is the Portuguese who spelled doom on this what? Trade, because they destroyed the infrastructure which had been put in place by the Arabs, and even the decline of the trade. Then another impact of the Swahili culture on the people was the evolution of the Swahili culture at the coast. It means with the coming of the Swahili, so it is only and only the culture that existed. What does that mean to the culture that was existent before? They got absorbed. There was absorption of the old cultures into the new culture, which is the Swahili. In other words, it was like no more traditional ways of life, but the new ones, which is the Swahili. New foodstuffs, we already saw those, and these stuffs included rice, plus meat, of course, which formed part of the best dish, which was called pilau. Then we said apart from this, they also ate other foods like vegetables, talk of oranges, talk of guavas, later apples, and to some extent, to a rare extent, pineapples. Pineapples were very common when the Portuguese arrived in the 15th century. In fact, it is the Portuguese who changed the name by adding a new Swahili word, nanas. They added some words on the Swahili vocabulary, and they called pineapples nanas. So pineapples were very much seen during the time of the what? Of the Portuguese. Another impact of the Swahili culture was that many towns developed. Example, Mombasa, Kilwa, Sofala, and many others. But there were five of them which were known as the principal centers of power. Five, including Mombasa, Kilwa, Sofala, Mogadishu, and Zanzibar. Those five were known as the principal centers of power. It is this that explained how power was very much centered on the coast. They were known as the principal centers of power. But with Kilwa being at the helm, Kilwa was at the top of all these towns. And of course, when we look at the growth of these coastal towns, we are told that Kilwa grew. One of the reasons that Kilwa was able to grow and surpass others, it was because it had, let me call it greed. It grew at the expense of others. It had what they call a greed expansion policy. Kilwa was expanding from the north. In fact, in all directions, it ate in all directions, and it was because of the presence of gold in Kilwa, and with the development of the Sofala gold mines, Kilwa started raiding her. You can see, so there was internal coastal rivalry, which of course explains on why coastal towns did decline. So we can see towns rising, and the five of them becoming the coast, principal centers, with Kilwa at the helm, and of course, Kilwa being developed in terms of infrastructure, in terms of structure, and that's why Kilwa was known as the jewel. Kilwa later came to be known as the jewel of the ZNG. And of course, jewel is glittering. Glittering like jewel or gold because of the way it was looking like. In fact, it later came to be known as Kisiwani. They later came to call it Kisiwani. It's like a very big plate where food was served, Kisiwani, and it was known as Kilwa coastal town. So that's the growth of towns. Then, apart from the towns, we saw Islam. Islam, we already saw it. Islam widely spread. But what was the impact of Islam? The impact of Islam was that one, it created the unity where people lived as brothers and sisters. In fact, it was rare for a Muslim to bypass a fellow Muslim without greeting. That was a sign of unity. It created unity and of course holiness. When you look at how, before holiness we are looking at brotherhood, especially being reflected in the ways of greeting. A fellow Muslim will greet, Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you. And then you also return the favor. So that was realized with the introduction of Islam. It fostered unity and of course moral ways of life also were very much realized. And of course we talked about the purity in Islam, where they were regarded as clean, especially when it came to time for taking ablution, cleansing themselves before they go for prayer. That's known as ablution, and that one makes them very holy. Clean. That's what Islam brought with it, and that was a result of the rise of the Swahili culture. Another impact of the Swahili culture was the Islam, which emphasized the Sharia law, improved on morality. Improved on what? On morality. We are told that Muslim women were specifically for their men. There was no any form of this kind of away games being played by the Muslim women, cheating of Muslim women on their men. It was rare. It was rare. So that's why we are saying morality did what? Improved. Why? Because they knew in case a woman did it, like having an affair outside the wedlock, you could face it rough because of the cruelness, the cruelty of the Sharia law, where it was said that it could not take the Qadi's time to order for the stoning of the women who had been convicted of this kind of immoral ways of life. So that is to do with Islam bringing about improved moral standards. In fact, a Muslim would stand with all the moral authority to ensure that he condemned all these immoral practices. That was the work of the Qadis, those who worked in the courts of law. Another impact of the rise of the Swahili culture was that the coast was exposed outside. What does this mean? Everything that was being done at the coast as a result of the rise of the Swahili culture did not remain there. People from all over the world, especially from the Far East, came to be attracted at the coast. They came to learn about the coast because of what was being done there. So that's what I'm saying. It did not only remain at the coast, but even beyond. And where? In the Middle East and the Far East countries. Another impact was that Arabs became new rulers. And of course, taking over from these local chiefs who were always there before the coming of the Arabs. So Arabs are taking over as new administrators in the form of sheikhs, khedives, sultans, name it. So this is how we can see the impact of this one. But the effects of the Swahili culture still, we have the Arabs becoming new rulers, and of course taking over from the traditional rulers, like the chiefs, who lost their administration or their power to the new rulers, the sultans, the sheikhs, and many others. Then food and eating changed, where we say that the ways of eating were very much influenced by the Arabs, where they sat cross-legged while eating, and of course they preferred using their hands while eating, and there was no use of either forks or spoons. They preferred eating with their hands and on very big plates known as the shamias. With the rise of the Swahili culture still, we look at the new dynasties emerging. Very many dynasties emerged at the coast, and the common one was the Shirazi. The common one was the Shirazi dynasty, which of course was as a result of the coming of more and more Arabs and intermixing with the coastal people, which of course gave rise to the Swahili. This one also brings us to population increase, because the period was between 1000 to 1500. That period marked the exodus or the movement of Arabs from Arabia, from the Arabian Peninsula and the coast. So by the time it clocked 1500, and of course this one is very much known as the time of the arrival of the Portuguese. So by the time the Portuguese arrived, the population had very much increased. Very many Arabs had arrived, and as a result of intermarriages, it gave rise to population increase. That's what we saw in most of those towns: Kilwa, Sofala, Mombasa, Mogadishu. Very many people were being seen. They were seen, especially when it came to the time of these gatherings, worshipping centers, administration time, and many other social gatherings. That's when you realize that the population was shooting up day by day. Then we already talked of the law, introduction of Sharia law. Of course, we say this was brought to change the ways of administration of justice. It was traditional way of administration of justice before the coming, where there were local courts, and they were being presided over by local. I cannot call them judges, but they were acting as judges. So they are the ones who acted and they imposed justice. And most of these people were not trained. They were not trained in the administration of justice. So that's why at times it was not justice, but just people using their own common knowledge to administer justice, and at times people were not contented. But with the rise of the Swahili culture, we saw a lot changing, and at least some minimum levels of justice being maintained. So the introduction of the Sharia law was very much respected, because it brought a new way of administration of justice. Then Islam became the common language at the coast, and of course everywhere. We saw Muslims everywhere as a result of the increase in the conversion rates. The rates at which they were being converted was high, and that was a blessing to some people at the cost. And lastly, we can look at some practices that were not common before the arrival of the Arabs, and that was some practices like circumcision. That was something that was not known at the coast. People didn't know this, and at first they resisted, by the way. They resisted circumcision, but of course with the continuous awareness and civic education, they started accepting, but still, especially in the south, others were still reluctant to take up these new changes. Another change was in the praying styles. People were not used to praying so much. Of course, I told you the ways of life before the coming of the Arabs was, of course, primitive, hunting and food gathering, especially for the Bushmen and the Hottentots. That was the way of life. But with the coming of the newcomers, we saw praying times changing from the traditional times to 5 times a day. And that is what we call devotion to Islam. A devoted Muslim prays 5 times a day. So this one was later copied. And another that was also not known was the fasting. The fasting of the Muslims, and which of course was in line with the teaching of the Quran. Fasting is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. So the host of people were also able to copy this, and with time most of them got absorbed into the new practices.